the first question I want to ask you guys, however, is that process and the topics that you brought up in your lesson plans, but particularly the process, how do you adapt that to, for instance, an adult education setting or a low literacy setting?
So I guess I can maybe take the lead in this. I would say the most important thing is to be having these conversations. So I think particularly with adult education or low literacy populations, it's really about having that conversation. I was about to say face-to-face, but I know that's not always possible in the current time period. So face-to-face or over Zoom and just starting the conversation. I actually think our restorative justice guide, while it was originally written for high schoolers, it can also be tailored for adult education and for adult learners, because so much of it is based on dialogue, right? This really rooted in community, non-hierarchical dialogue that I think can be a lot more welcoming to adults as they kind of explore their own experiences and reactions around what is going on, really just giving them an open space to talk about it. I think specifically thinking about Asian American populations that we've worked with, there has been really entrenched cycles of silence around issues of race within our homes. And so even just having an open opportunity and guidance on how to begin to articulate these experiences can be extremely powerful and extremely effective.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have really much to add to that. I do think just part of sort of creating this guide in the 4-step process, we worked with Dr. Wang, the mental health specialist, who I think she specifically, works primarily with adults, including a lot of people who are Asian American or of immigrant backgrounds. And I think part of this is just having a conversation and asking questions. And so there are questions that we provide in the guide that I think, it doesn't matter how old you are, you can kind of engage in that reflection. And I think that's often an important first step. I will say, I think we found, right, like often Asian Americans that we work with, maybe they're a little bit uncomfortable about kind of unpacking some of these things for themselves. But they really want concrete tools for their kids, right? So a lot of the requests we get is, I'm worried that my kids will see me getting attacked in the street. So how do I talk to them? But I think very much, right, as part of this process is also how do you kind of heal from that incident yourself, right? Because you really can't support your kids if you can't sort of, right, process the trauma that you yourself have experienced. So I think in the guide, it's a very long guide, but there is a section, right, on how to kind of process and use grounding activities for yourself before you even engage in these conversations with your kids. And I think that's definitely something you can adapt for an adult learning classroom.
And Paul, among state standards that require history curriculums to include Asian American experiences, many only require teaching about the Chinese immigration to the United States in the 19th century and the internment of Japanese Americans. What is the implication of teaching only these two events? And, it happens to other ethnic groups as well, right?
Yeah, I think the tendency is to compartmentalize our understanding of anything that deals with not the white mainstream interpretation of American history. We have a unit on slavery, for example. We say that's our discussion of Black experience, for example. And then we move on to the little compartment, even if we do that. And I think we have to see this as all a part of American history. It's not a sideshow. It's not a part of it. It's fundamental to it. And you can call that what you will. Other people might call it critical race theory. I know we're not supposed to use terms like that, but it is an attempt to argue that racism and these forces that we talked about for people of color have been at the fundamental part of the American experiment ever since the beginning. And to sort of say that it's been something that was a sideshow and got solved and we moved on or something like that, I think that's the point that we have to understand. The enduring realities of these impacts, and that's the point I tried to make. Well, there's been so much attention placed on these ideas of perpetual foreignness and model minority in the recent discussions. The point is that these are things that have been experienced by Asian Americans historically since the very beginning. And even the incidents of anti-Asian violence that Kathy and Julia have provided such brilliant analysis about how to deal with. These things weren't created by the epidemic. These things were made clear by the epidemic. And these feelings, this treatment of kids in the schools and so forth for being different have been a factor that's really accompanied their experience here in the United States well before the epidemic itself. I think it's cast some light on it and had some attention on it, thank God. But I think it's something we have to understand. It's nothing that's going to go away when the COVID-19 process goes away, and it's something we got to be continually attentive about.
And Paul, you did talk about Asian Americans as perpetual foreigners, as being invisible. And of course, we have this surge in anti-Asian hate crimes. Is that perpetual foreigner situation at all changing? And Kathy and Julia, what more can educators do to dismantle that?
Well, let me say that Julia and Kathy have really given some expert ways in which teachers and so forth can deal with this on a daily basis, particularly in the schools, the K through 12 grades and so forth. I'm much more general in my approach, which is I've sort of been talking about these things for 40 something years, given the same talk. It's been after, it's after Vincent Chin, I can give the same talk. After Wen Ho Lee, I can give the same talk. After 9/11, I can give the same talk. But in some ways, its question is anybody listening, and hopefully people are now listening. If I were alive in 1882, I could give the same talk. If I were lived in 1924 or 1942, I can give the same talk, I think. But I want to stop giving the same talk, and hopefully people are now listening and that they'll understand the history of Asian Americans, that there's much more behind this than just the current situation. Understand that it is a part of being a person of color in the United States, a history dominated by a dominant group that has to understand that the white supremacy and notions of white supremacy have been really fundamental to the American experience, and it's caught all of us groups, of non-white groups in some way in that particular problem. And to understand that, I think is a understandable critique, but it's a way moving forward. Understanding is a way moving forward. And I hope this understanding helps.
Yes, we completely echo everything that Dr. Watanabe is saying. And I think would just add, I mean, maybe it's clear from the resources we're putting out and from the name of our organization, we think it's so important to be teaching Asian American history in schools. I think education is one of the touch points where we can really shape somebody's worldview and attitude towards other groups in society. And something that Julia and I say a lot is that Asian American history, immigrant history, is American history. It's not about changing US history. It's about bringing to light parts of US history that had been, I would say, oftentimes deliberately erased or whitewashed from our textbooks and our classrooms. And so when you look at US history, the work of Asian Americans and of immigrants are embedded into almost every single part of US history. And it's really just about bringing those narratives out and incorporating them into your daily work of teaching students. And this is stuff that you can find in resources from IHI and resources from PBS. I know a lot of people produce these lesson plans, and that oftentimes teachers just don't get enough support in incorporating this into the classroom, incorporating this into a very, very tightly packed curriculum. And I would say to that, that we need to work harder with school administrations to really advocate for the inclusion of these histories into curriculum standards so that teaching them becomes something that teachers are expected to do and rewarded for doing, as opposed to something that teachers do in their free time on their own dime, really working to try to make their classrooms as inclusive and representative as possible. I would say another point, just to add on to the curriculum point, is that we found that it's actually really powerful for schools to reach out directly to families and have affinity group spaces. Mm-hmm. So some work that Julia and I recently did with Boston Public Schools is we ran family targeted workshops for different Asian American families that were part of Boston Public Schools. And these were spaces for parents just to join freely and talk about what they were experiencing, what they were really worried about. And because they were in these affinity group spaces, we were able to provide targeted language interpretation so that people could join regardless of their English abilities, etc. And I think that is another really important way of bringing their voices into the school community and showing them that they are an active and valued member.
Yeah, can I say that there's a bit of an effort now to include ethnic studies and mandate it through legislative actions across the country. which I'm in favor for, but I am only in favor if we have the proper training of the people before they do it. And that I think is often missing. There's a notion that you can mandate something that anybody can teach us stuff and have the kind of sensibilities and training that Emily and Julia, that Kathy and Julia pointed out are necessary. If you don't have that kind of training, that kind of understanding behind it, you cannot really do justice to this kind of training in ethnic studies for any racial group or any group within the United States in which you want to talk about these sorts of things. So I really stress that we should do training before we do opening up the classes and mandating this stuff, because the training is absolutely critical. And on the final point that that Kathy made about voices, I think it's critical. You know, we're often asking students are often looking for role models, and I know for Asian Americans, we've tried to point out who are the Asian American heroes that they might have or role models. And despite the fact there was a recent poll that asked Americans to name their most prominent Asian American, 42% could not come up with a single Asian American of prominence. And those that did come up came up with people like Bruce Lee, who's been dead for almost 50 years. There are prominent Asian Americans. There's the Vice President of the United States, for example. You know, there's Yo-Yo Ma. There's all kinds of people in the arts and in industry and sports and so forth. But to me, I think that one of the great resources that we often don't realize in terms, particularly immigrants, is the people who live next door, people down the street, the parents that live next door. And Immigrant Learning Center understands this better than anybody. The stories of heroism that many of these people face. Think about the refugees who came over from the 1970s into the United States and populated many of our communities. Their stories are really something that should really be focused upon. They're the people that can be role models, and they're the people next door. They're the people in our neighborhood. They're the people down the street. And I think we got to be prepared to understand that they are the real people who can talk in real terms about this immigrant experience in the United States.
That was a really great point, and I don't think many people knew that. Min in the chat box mentioned that every student needs to see himself or herself in what they're being taught. But in this moment where we have politicized basic facts, historical facts, contextualization, how do teachers sort of navigate that sort of sensitivity that maybe parents may have?
You've hit upon a question, Denzel, that we are still trying to figure out ourselves. I noticed a lot of chatter in the chat about the specter of critical race theory, and I think that has just become such a buzzword, really, I think, fueled by conservative media. And it's hard, I think. So Julia and I actually work with a lot of parent activists, particularly in the New Jersey area, who are working hard to encourage school districts and the legislature to incorporate API voices and narratives into the curriculum across different subjects. And what we have heard from them repeatedly is that they are waiting with bated breath for the anti-CRT contingent to show up. At this point, I think they haven't had a lot of pushback just yet, but are certain that this pushback is going to materialize, and trying to think of strategies of how to circumvent that or how to counter that right now. And I think it's very difficult because there's so much misinformation being spread right now. And I saw multiple people in the chat also talk about that too. And I think this specter of CRT has become like a boogeyman, and very few people actually understand what CRT is, or what the theory actually is, what is actually being said and what is being advocated for, right? And so I think a lot of it is about correcting this misinformation, trying to push back against that tide. Unfortunately, I don't have anything very concrete for you right now, because I think it's a very hard question, and it's a very important question, and something that I think we are working hard on, and I think a lot of other groups are working hard on, and hopefully we'll begin to make some headway in.
I mean, I don't have a lot to add. Sorry. Oh, just to say one thing. I do think, I think not to kind of get into the sort of details of this fight that's happening at the school board level, but I think, there are lots of parents who want this curriculum included in the schools. I think a lot of them are just starting to activate. So I definitely think it's kind of, it's a critical moment, I think, for parents to voice, right, the need for this history as well.
And just keeping it with you, Julie and Kathy, from your experience working with parent activists, how do they approach discussing these topics at home, outside of the school? Could you just tell us what has worked and what's some obstacles to overcome? And I know we have Laura Gardner coming up. If you search on our website, she did a great presentation a couple of years ago on engaging a family engagement, so you should really check that out. But Julie and Kathy?
Sorry, specifically what has worked in advocating for ethnic studies, or?
With parent activists, how have you seen them approach these topics at home or outside of the school?
These topics meaning Asian American history or studies? Okay. So I think with the parent activists that we have worked with, a lot of them are really active in terms of downloading lesson plans themselves that are free off the website and teaching them to their kids, working really hard to scour the internet for related books and picture books that they can read with their children. I would say that the tack that they have taken with schools is relatively straightforward. And I think a lot of schools have been very responsive. When the parents say that there is a need, that their children aren't seeing themselves in the curriculum, and that this is a critical matter for student empowerment and for student engagement. I think when a large enough parent contingent comes together and says that, schools tend to listen. And I think this is also partly why we really encourage parents to kind of speak up. I think when nonprofits and organizations do it, it's still powerful, but there's something to be said about hearing directly from the parents that the schools are serving.
So one example, we worked with a lot of parents in Connecticut, and some of the parent leaders who worked on this workshop with us that became this guide. A lot of them, I think, were working with the school to curate, right, like social and emotional learning resources, Asian American history resources. And I think often, instead of being kind of on the opposite end with educators, like often parents can be a really powerful resource. So they provide a lot of to be honest, like free labor that I think educators, right, don't have the capacity to kind of spend time on when you're dealing with so many things in the classroom. And so we, like as an organization, definitely work with a lot of parents to kind of bridge, right, that communication with schools. So one example is we're currently working on an elementary curriculum project in New Jersey with some of the parents who wanted to see that in the classroom, right? And the school was very open, but they needed help, right? They needed experts to kind of go in and actually provide the resources. And so I think often like that kind of ecosystem can be created with parents' initiative. And that's really, it can be really helpful for schools.
Dr. Watanabe, close us out with this discussion. You said that we need to claim our spot as a strategy to come out of invisibility. How do we go about claiming our spots?
Well, I think we have to understand that in this debate, for example, about critical race theory and so forth, the whole question is this. There are those who say that the narrative of American history and teaching should be about that we're all Americans, and that's the fundamental basis of it. And it's true, we should talk about our common identity as Americans. But those Americans are increasingly becoming people of color. We're going to soon reach, within 20 years, a proposition where most of the people in the United States are not white, they're people of color. And the fact that those people have that as part of their identity, race is a critical part of their identity. Being an American is a critical part of their identity, but they don't put race aside. How do we speak to that racial part of their identity too? The experience that's there. It may be a celebratory one, it may be a critical one, but we can't ignore that reality if we're going to really talk about the reality that doesn't confront people just in history books, and it confronts the kids that appear for us in front of our classrooms every day. That's a reality that we have to speak to. And by ignoring that element, ignoring the element of race, which I really think the attack on critical race theory says, we're going to have a de-race sort of discussion of American history. We can do so, but we're talking about something that is irrelevant and not relevant to the new reality that confronts so many of our students. So it's critical that we accept these notions, that we learn from them, hopefully that we'll improve upon them. And hopefully if there is a notion that education, the fundamental purpose of education, which is to improve our society, improve the reality that confronts our people within the society, can move forward, understanding that race and a critical understanding of race is central to that moving forward. If we can bring that notion together, I think we can move together in sort of pursuing a variety of agendas for which educators and all of you here, and that's why I admire you so much, it's being placed right in your laps, and I understand you, and I understand and applaud you for trying to handle that fundamental responsibility. It's as important now as it ever was in the history of the country.
Professor Paul Watanabe of the Institute for Asian American Studies, and Kathy Liu and Julia Wang from the Immigrant History Initiative, thank you so much for enlightening us and giving us these tools and this context where we can go forward and make some positive change. Thank you.